Nichelle, welcome to Fair Dialogues.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I really am excited about this.
I loved meeting you in April. I think this is where we first connect, although we probably were in the LinkedIn circuit for a while. But you've made our experience much richer, to be honest, through your contribution. So I had to kind of find a way to interact in a more intimate one-on-one space. So we decided to make it. But
Very cool.
wait, because I put my sound everywhere else. That's good. So how are you? How have you been since April?
Good. It's been a whirlwind of a year. It's almost
Mhm.
over. That feels
Yeah.
strange. But I've had a good summer. I saw family. I traveled. I'll be doing some more traveling into the year to see family. I have my wedding anniversary tomorrow. So a lot of good things have been happening, and but I am looking forward to a bit of rest at the end of the year. So, but it's been good. I've been enjoying it, and yeah, really just continuing to engage online with your content and other content, DEI content, culture content, pay content. And I'm excited to be here to share my thoughts about all this pay and culture stuff.
And not only thoughts, like Nichelle here is super experienced. So I'm very happy to bring that perspective, both from a geographical depth of work, type of organizations, as we are exploring these connections between culture, DEI, pay programs in the modern world. Although sometimes I feel we're going backwards. So I'm not really sure. We really want to understand a little bit more how compensation really aligns with workplace inclusion and culture itself, but what is also the impact when we do have a bit of a strategy, right? Like this is what we I think I'm expecting from you. Because on one side we do have the policies and do have the programs, but then we have the actual human experience of working for an organization that takes care of this part, and the human experience of working with organizations that don't take care of this part.
Mhm.
Nichelle here is a people and culture leader for more than 15 years, specifically in Total Rewards. But what I've witnessed and seen from you also, the really big umbrella that you continue to cover and expand into. And I think, especially with the dignity standard that I saw you launched a while back, you've been really trying to weave in your conversation about rewards and pay this idea of what is equity, what is equitable experience, and what is equitable treatment, all for a more healthy work environment, for a more performant work environment, for more innovation, for more collaboration. So I'm very, very happy to have you here, Nichelle, with us today.
Thank you very much. Very excited. Very excited.
For those who are here the first time, the fair dialogues are happening on a weekly basis, except next week because I'm traveling in Amsterdam and busy with some conferences, so I cannot be in two places at once. Unfortunately, I wish. But otherwise, we are fully booked. I think till end of January. Every Thursday, meet us at 4:30, almost on the dot, or to be honest, with topics around workplace inclusion, but from all different angles. So we help you get more equipped, get more inspired, but also get more questioning. Am I doing the right thing? Maybe can I change something? So it's all about change. Um, Michelle, I think for us, I would love to start with understanding a little bit more where you're coming from in terms of why are you doing this, how did you end up doing this, because I think for me these type of key moments in time in defining the work that I do, maybe the approach, are continuing to keep me anchored. So I'm very curious on your side if you can share what is that pivotal moment in your career that made you passionate and focused on culture and total rewards.
So you mentioned earlier this model I created called the Dignity Standard. And it is a culture and DEI model, but a culture model specifically that encompasses four components: respect,
Mhm,
value, ethical treatment, and accountability.
mhm,
And I came up with this in 2021. But when I think about a pivotal moment that got me there, it would
yeah.
have been the beginning of my career, actually.
Okay.
So the second job I had in my career, I worked at a company where I enjoyed the work, enjoyed my colleagues, enjoyed my boss. But I found out that I was intentionally paid 10,000 less than the person sitting in an office next to me who had no experience when they walked into that job. in terms of doing that work, and
Mhm.
who also didn't have the same level of education. And
Mhm.
so I had been doing the kind of rewards work at that point for 3 years, and I also got my master's degree to kind of boost myself. So when I found that out, of course, everything I thought about my experience was dissolved, right? Because
Yeah.
I was enjoying myself, thinking as well that I was being paid well and fairly, and I
Mhm.
find out that I'm not.
Yeah.
Um, and there are a lot of emotions involved with that. But I mean, at the time, a lot of emotions involved with that. But what I will say is, what I learned in that experience was that where there is smoke, there is fire. So a lot of people, I mean, I don't know if it's culturally relevant everywhere, but I think we all have some sort of saying like this in our culture and our language where, ultimately this is a symptom of a bigger problem.
Mhm.
And in that experience, what I learned was that across the department, or in the department, there was a big lack of leadership,
Mhm.
respecting, valuing, and
Mhm.
educating their employees.
Mhm.
So me being paid 10K less was just a symptom of what they were doing in
Just
other
yeah.
areas. So
Yeah.
the culture of that environment
Mhm.
lended itself to me being paid 10,000 less.
Mhm.
Um, and for me, comp is like the lowest hanging fruit everywhere.
Mhm.
The lowest hanging fruit because it's a common denominator. It is everybody's going to work to get a paycheck.
Yeah.
Everybody.
Yeah.
That is our entry point. Every single one of us who has a job, our entry point is show me the money. Give me my
Yeah.
paycheck. So it can't be the root. It is always a symptom. And so
Mhm.
when you have pay problems, there is a culture problem that needs
Mhm.
to be addressed and looked into. So yeah, that's
Yeah.
kind of how I started thinking about culture,
Yes.
connect that because I experienced inequitable pay.
So I don't want to necessarily put a number on your age, but you said at the beginning of my career. When was this?
This was so this is 2020, 2024, right? Oh, gosh.
Yeah.
This was 2012 or 13.
All right. So let's take it today. From that point on to today, what are you kind of like big picture? What's happening in the market? Where are we standing in terms of this dignity standard?
We're in a dignity crisis. It's,
Okay.
we are. It's not just at work. It's across our culture. It's across our every pillar of our culture has a dignity
Yeah.
crisis, and I define dignity as upholding everyone's humanity.
Mhm.
So I've broken it down to 4 components, so it's practical to consider and think about. But it's upholding humanity, and
Mhm.
when you think about work, work is a right. We
Mhm.
all have the right to use our gifts and skills and talents to better our lives. That doesn't always mean the work that, like, not all the work you do is paid work, right?
Mhm.
People who are parents know that, people who are caregivers know that, people who are creatives know that, right? So the work of our lives isn't always about a job,
Mhm.
but
Mhm.
one type of work is job, and
Yeah.
job means you get paid. And so if we're going to continue to work, because we're going to need to in these environments in this society, we also need to be respected and valued. And there
Mhm.
has to be some framework for the principles we operate in to morally treat each other well around pay, not just how we speak to each other, which is a
Yeah.
part of it, but how do we pay each other?
Yeah.
So I think we have a dignity crisis. I think that most companies do.
Mhm.
I don't know if it's getting better or worse, but I do know that when I think about the kind of companies I want to work for, I want to make
Mhm.
sure that yeah, I want to make sure that my humanity is upheld, and so is everyone else around me. And as a total works professional, I help
Mhm.
do that through creating, strategizing around pay programs and making them fair.
But let's dissect a little bit more that because if you know, look now at most of, let's say, modern organizations and you check their career website, there is a page with values. And
Yeah.
those values in general are very positive, humane, we care, we are
Yes.
humble, we empower you, we value you, right? And I think that is in essence a wish, an aspiration for most organization. But as you're saying, sometimes we have these symptoms where we don't see that happening, right? And there are signals that those values are not upheld. Ultimately, where do you start really connecting the part of pay equity and organizational culture? If pay equity, as you're saying, or pay is such a brick somehow in the foundation layer, is just doing the right thing, but organizational culture can be such a monster ultimately.
Yeah.
weird, because you're working also and consulting with organizations around this part. I'm very curious, what is the most surprising insight that you have when it comes to this connection?
You mentioned values, right? So you've got stated values
Mm-hmm.
and you have lived values.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of companies talk about culture of inclusivity and all these big things, but when you examine their compensation practices, remember this is the lowest hanging fruit.
Yeah.
When you examine their comp practices, you're going to find some bias, systemic biases, right, that
Uh-huh.
are going to reflect the fact they have a different lived experience than what the values are actually stating online.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and really, what's surprising is how often inequities exist,
Mm-hmm.
not because of intentional decisions in a specific instance,
Yeah.
but because the processes that have been created, right, on the back of this lived versus stated culture,
Mm-hmm.
um, they're not built to hold decision makers accountable. And this is the connection point, accountability
Mm-hmm.
between
Mm-hmm.
the stated values and your lived values, how you hold accountable to the stated ones. At one time, I was working for a company. A recruiter called me. The company itself had a hire program for engineers. So,
Yeah.
and the recruiter called. They were ramping up. The program is for early in career engineers. So a
Yeah.
lot of hires coming in. The recruiter called and said, "Hey, I've got this job open. Got this person. I'm really excited. He's male. So she didn't tell me he was male, but she kind of gave me his profile, and
Sure.
he's male. And can we pay him $70K?"
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, well, it's fine. It's in the, we booked this book for the
Mm-hmm.
program, so it's fine. Go off, make it happen. Um, the next day, I'm not even kidding. The next day, the same recruiter called me and said, "Oh, same spiel, and she da 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 da, and we want to pay her $60K." And I was like, "I'm sorry, what's the
Yeah.
difference?" This
Yeah.
is an early in careers program, right? So everybody has no experience.
Yeah.
Like people are walking,
We just trust them at this point on their word.
So I was like, "You just called me yesterday about this person." And the
Yes.
recruiter, "Oh, yeah, that's right." And I realized that
Yeah.
this recruiter wasn't doing something on
Yeah.
purpose. They literally were just like, "I got to get people in seats."
And the
And what,
expectation mentioned by the candidate probably was that, and like
yeah,
this is
there
face
we go.
value, right? Mm-hmm.
So the problem was that in that process, there was no accountability.
Mm-hmm.
No one was holding the recruiters accountable for what they were
Mm-hmm.
making decisions about. I
Correct.
just so happened to be inserted into the process because she called me.
Yeah.
So a lot of this comes down to accountability, right?
Mm-hmm.
Are we going to hold ourselves, to our decisions, and those decisions being backed into our
Mm-hmm.
values? And
Mm-hmm.
often that does not happen, particularly around pay.
Mm. Do we have any success stories? Because I think I've seen attempts, or I've watched maybe from the sidelines some of these things and getting the effects, sometimes positive, sometimes not so good, but usually seeing the, let's say, the packaging. But you've formed this type of programs, you've helped organization move through a more equitable state. I would love if you have an example for us, because I would love to kind of understand what are maybe 2 3 steps that organization usually take to transform these pay policies towards a more equitable state.
So when you mentioned before about what was a pivotal moment for my career,
Yeah.
that my own pay inequity problem was a pivotal moment. But another pivotal moment was when a company I worked for was specifically doing executive pay analysis.
Mm-hmm.
And they were looking at pay equity between men and women in their executive positions. And what I found really interesting about this was that what they were trying to do was make sure that the men and women, because it wasn't, this was a while ago, so it
Yeah.
wasn't like now you have this mandate of 40%, it wasn't
Mm-hmm.
like
Mm-hmm.
that. At the time, probably 30% women, 70% men
Mm-hmm.
in executive positions, but they were really diving into this difference in pay. And it was a success story because what was great in terms of like why it was a success is because the CEO, CFO, the general counsel
Mm-hmm.
were all aligned and were the
Mm-hmm.
face of this pay equity audit. And
Mm-hmm.
so I was doing the audit with their guidance, and they were very clear where you find a problem, and the leading executive, the person that they were the reporting manager, doesn't have documented, backed up reasons for the
Mm-hmm.
difference, we will fill the gap.
Yeah.
Done. Finished, over with. And I was like, "Oh, y'all can do that?" Like you could just tell them, and this was a big company, and so the business unit had to pay for it. The headquarters
Mm,
wasn't paying; the business had to pay for it. Now there weren't that many problems. I'll be
okay.
honest, there weren't that many problems, but it was interesting because what made it successful was that you've got these executive leaders who are highly
Yeah.
respected saying that we're holding the line, right? We're going to be accountable for this. You're
Hmm.
responsible for this. There is no ifs, ands, or buts about it.
Hmm.
Um, it was a pivotal moment because it helped me understand the power of executive leadership
Hmm.
and them holding themselves accountable and then going out and making sure the business operates that way.
Hmm.
So there are success stories, and I have a
Yes.
couple more, but and I will also say this that we talk a lot about pay equity as if pay equity is running rampant
Yeah.
every corner. It's not true. It's just
Mm.
not true. What happens is we live in a world where we get information online and what is pumped to us is all the negative.
Sure.
No news outlet's going to go, look at how great this company. That's not how you get engagement online and
Yeah.
clicks, right? You need something controversial. So I will say to, people on the call on this webinar or just people in general, like what you have to understand is that companies are always making challenging decisions. They're weighing the risks of hiring people, they're weighing the,
Hmm.
the cost of it as well. And generally, companies don't do so bad. They
Hmm.
don't do so bad. They don't do
Yeah.
perfect. They don't do perfect.
Yeah.
And everybody has a anecdotal experience, either
Yes.
themselves or a friend or family member, right?
Yeah.
Where things didn't go so well for
Yeah.
me specifically. But in the course of 15 plus years,
Hmm.
I have rarely found a company just out there doing the worst. Just I haven't found that. I found some structural problems that need
Hmm.
to be addressed, individual problems need to be addressed. And when executives put their weight behind it, it gets addressed when they do that.
Yeah. And I'm so happy you said that. To be honest, I'm so happy because I think, of course, in terms of pushing the agenda for gender equity in general, the pay conversation was used massively, both governmental, institutional, societal, right? And I think it's a good narrative to pick on, but
Mhm.
then it tends to skew a little bit of the conversation. And my experience somehow, as I started saying, but I kind of wanted to hear you first, is like once you start looking a little bit under the hood and measuring, you see that first of all, maybe it's not so cray cray,
Mhm.
but it's also solvable if you have
Yes.
that accountability. And let's start there. Like, I think the measurement part is always a bit scary for people who don't dabble in this field, and they're like, oh, I don't want to open this can of worms. I'm sure it's going to be super bad and I would not know how to solve it, and etc etc etc, excuses, right? But once and now we see people like you, we see tooling actually, which is, if well implemented, you have this information in real time, and you can also almost kind of do it month by month, recorrect things and be very mindful of stuff. I've seen an organization here, it's a kind of French Spanish global but huge huge huge, I'm not going to name names, but they've made a pay correction of 10%, like just out of the blue, because they did an audit and they saw we have 30,000 people who are, a bit new comparing to other 30,000 people that we hired 10 years ago. So it is possible. But where does one start? What do we look at first if I want to start some measurement?
So it doesn't start with a pay audit. And I know
Okay.
that sounds very like, huh? Because most people think it does. It actually starts with the definition of jobs.
Hmm.
So a job structure, job architecture, job framework, whatever you want to call it. This is a system of how you define your jobs. This is how you actually build your organization in
Yeah.
terms of looking at jobs and where they need to be to help you, reach business goals. And for larger companies, they have this in place already, right? The traditional
Hmm.
companies, 100 years old, is in place because it's not even possible to run a company
To
without a job
function. Yeah.
structure. But a lot of companies who are newer or just younger or
Hmm.
with less employees, sometimes they might be older but less employees.
Hmm.
They kind of haphazardly create jobs, right,
Yeah.
without the background structure. So it starts with your job structure because your
Hmm.
job structure is the central piece of your talent management system.
Hmm.
It speaks to what you pay jobs, right?
Hmm.
It speaks to what kind of jobs you are going to hire for. It
Yeah.
speaks to promotions and succession planning. It speaks to budgeting with finance because
Mhm.
you need the job to understand what kind of pay it's going to be. It speaks to every part of talent management, and so it starts with a job structure. You have to have
Yeah.
a job system.
Mhm.
Then you want to move on, of course, to now we're talking about a pay equity audit because now
Yeah.
you've got a job structure to actually compare jobs
Connect. Mhm. Mhm.
appropriately. You have to compare apples to apples. Now you
Mhm.
should not be comparing a director to an
Mhm.
entry-level senior engineer, right? This doesn't make sense. This
Yeah.
is not
Yeah.
making sense. So you have to compare apples to apples, and then you do a pay equity audit,
Yeah.
and you look for the similar jobs and settings where you may have pay equity issues. And you know, to be honest, for anybody on the call who's at a smaller company, at least 150 employees or more, I say smaller because I've had bigger companies. Because the EU pay directive is already in place, you should be done with your jobs and you
Yes.
system, and you should be done with your pay equity audit. If you are not, get on it because in June 2027, you're
Yeah.
going to have to report on your 2026 pay gap. And if you have a 5% or more pay gap, you're going to have to address it.
Mhm.
And so you're going to need all of
Retrospectively, right?
yeah. Well, I don't know if it's retrospective actually.
Mm.
I don't know if the directive says that,
Mhm.
but the directive only gives a guideline to countries. The countries might determine that's going to be the
Yeah.
case if it's not in the directive.
Mhm.
So
Correct.
that's a good point. It could go back, right?
Yeah.
But that being said, and you should be done with those two things because pay is not just your compensation in your pocket. The EU pay directive looks at pay as a number of factors, so total
Mhm.
compensation, including
Mhm.
benefits. So
Yes.
you need to know what your job system is,
Mhm.
define all of your pay elements, of course, as well, and do a pay audit on all
Mhm.
of that.
Mhm. Mhm.
Because you're going to need all of 2025 and 2026 to address it before you have to report it.
Yes.
And when I say that, it's because finance teams, they are already right now, if your
Yeah.
fiscal year is January to December, of course, they've already got their initial, if not already done, forecasting
Mhm.
for 2025. And
Mhm.
forecasting includes how much pay we're going to increase, the next
Yeah.
year.
Yeah.
So if your comp teams or awards teams, or if you don't have a rewards team, if this isn't happening, you're putting your finance team in a bad position because they're not prepared to spend that money. So got to get on it. Anyway, so jobs
Yeah.
first, pay equity on it, and then pay policy audit.
Mhm.
Before you actually change any pay, you should be looking at what are our pay policies and how did we get here? It
Mhm.
didn't happen accidentally.
Sure.
It did happen. It wasn't intentional by people, individual people, but your
Mhm.
system is set up to create this inequity wherever you found it, right?
Yeah.
So looking at your pay policy audit, and if you're a really large company, that takes a lot of time because you might have different pay policies in different countries, right?
Mhm.
Because of different laws, and that could be part of why you have pay inequity. So jobs, pay equity audit, pay policy audit, then of
Mhm.
course changing the policies if you need to, and obviously filling those gaps. I will say that a lot of people get really caught up and really
Yeah.
in the wrong places, and they start talking about market pay. Whenever they talk about
Mhm.
all of a sudden it's market pay, and we got to
Mhm.
get market data, and we got to, and I will tell you, no, you don't. Data is addressing external
Mm.
competitiveness. Pay equity is addressing internal pay. You
Mhm.
don't need market data to do
Mhm.
a pay equity audit and fill gaps.
Mhm. Mhm.
You will need market data to determine your external pay
Yeah.
competitiveness, and you might also want to fill gaps that way. But
Mhm.
you don't have to do them at the same time if you don't have the money or the time to.
Mhm.
So pay equity is all about internal pay and fairness, and you
Mhm.
can do it without external input in terms of market pay.
I think this is a place where a lot of leaders get a bit caught up
Mhm.
because you maybe are a bit unsure on what are those internal policies and what has happened internally for a while. And I think you've laid somehow the foundation for very specific things where all that then needs to be packaged usually in a pay philosophy that needs to be present and communicated on a regular basis from your hiring, onboarding, performance management, promotions, maybe even exits if you want to like reduce workforce. You kind of also get back to your pay policies,
Mhm.
and defining certain perks or benefits, which are very different country by country and company by company, I feel, or cultural habits, let's say so, when it comes to running a company. I see organizations in France or Belgium who are giving cars as they are, you know,
Yeah.
pizzas in other companies.
Yeah.
It is the reality, but that is part of that component of reward, overall reward. But then also, how do you ensure a good communication of that philosophy? Where What do you recommend organizations to actually manage that communication well as well? All right, like, you count on some experts to make you the zeros and the ones, then on some experts to do the more legal and tax part, but you need good communication to have layman's terms so everybody's like, why we're doing this and why does it look like this.
So I want to go back a little bit because you
Mm-hmm.
mentioned the comp philosophy and pay policy. Most companies, young companies, don't have this at all.
True.
And what I will say is that sometimes you need to do some of the work before you create one.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I say that because getting the data helps you determine where you actually are and where you want to go. So, but another step in what I said about defining your jobs and pay equity would also be to define your your pay
Mm-hmm.
philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And the pay philosophy is just, what do we pay for?
Yeah.
And at what level do we pay it? That's really all it comes down to.
Mm-hmm.
And determining what you pay for is important because you're also able to determine how you increase salaries, right? Do we pay for tenure? If you don't pay for tenure, no one should get an increase because they've been there for 10 years,
Yeah.
right? This is pretty straightforward. So it's a good point you make about pay philosophy. And sometimes it can be done before, sometimes you're doing it in the middle,
Mm-hmm.
along with the process itself. It all depends on the company and what you're trying to achieve in the short term.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a part of it too. So in terms of communication, when I was in second grade, or maybe third grade, we learned the journalistic model
Mm-hmm.
of like asking questions or like determining a story. It was when, where, why,
Mm-hmm.
when, how, what, and then who.
Mm-hmm.
That's all you have to do when you communicate pay. If you're talking about layman's terms, who is impacted, who's making decisions, when is it happening, why? This is the most critical one. Why are we doing this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, when is this going to happen, right? How are you going to do it? What are the processes? How did you make this choice? How are you going to make it happen? So it's really simple. Going back to
Yeah.
third grade, those 7 kind of basic questions on how you get a story told, because you have to tell a story to your
Mm-hmm.
employees. I don't mean a lie or a fib. I mean storytelling
Yeah.
around the decisions that you're making as a team. And transparency is that, is just
Mm-hmm.
answering those questions.
Mm-hmm.
It's not more complicated than that. When I recently had someone ask me the question, how do you deal with employees who are like, frustrated
Yeah.
about, whatever. And I said, adults are reasonable,
Yeah.
but when you're not honest and straightforward, you're being unreasonable. Now they become
Mm-hmm.
unreasonable, right? So just be reasonable
Yeah.
and treat your employees like the adults they are. I mean, you've got companies asking people to represent them on a national level. And these are not executive roles either. We're talking about
Yes.
account managers going out, representing on a national level. You've got people who are responsible for millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in the finance group and what comes and what goes. And
Mm-hmm.
we can't just say the basic what, when, why, where, who, and how of compensation. That doesn't make any sense. It's unreasonable.
Yeah.
So if you're going to respect and value your employees, treat them like adults and be reasonable with them and just tell them those things. And I have been in conversations behind closed doors with executives who are making hard choices.
Mm-hmm.
Some of those decisions are confidential because they do have an impact on their competitive landscape for them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They have an impact on what's going to happen in terms of how employees perceive them and the external market perceives them as well.
Sure.
And those are hard choices to make on what you say and what you don't say. But I think that when you build a culture of trust and transparency around making sure people understand the basics of how you make decisions and why you make them, you can
Mm-hmm.
also say to your employees, there's a piece of this is very confidential that we actually can't speak about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
About keeping it from you. It's about recognizing we have a business responsibility to honor the business and respect that confidentiality. Here's what we will tell you.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Sometimes you ain't got to do all that. Just
Yeah.
telling them the basics is enough, right? But Um, I just say be reasonable because then your employees will be too. And I have always found that employees, even if they don't agree, because you're allowed not to agree, like
Sure.
what
That's
relationship,
also the point. Yeah.
like, what kind of relationship do you have
Yeah.
where you can't disagree with each other? No, you can say, I don't agree with this choice,
Yeah.
but they will understand it when you treat them reasonably and are transparent.
For me, this boils down a lot into giving people the option to decide for themselves. I feel a lot of this kind of keeping too much under behind closed doors is because, like, I'm gonna decide for you what's best for you. I'm doing this because I think this is what's best for you, and no sane, full fully in faculties person would say, you know what's best for me. They Nobody will agree with this on you. So it's like, why are you taking my power away for me to decide whether I stay with you and I kind of go on this journey, whatever happens, or go somewhere else, because the world is big and I should have choices, right? And this kind of removal of choice is probably what upsets a lot of people.
Yes, it does. It's a really good point. And I find that this kind of what we call a patriarchal view of, I
Hmm.
will make choices for you or because I said so, or it's kind of the childification of adult employees. A lot of it comes down to fear.
Hmm.
And I'll be quite honest with you, any leader who doesn't have a coach or a therapist,
Yeah.
like a CEO who doesn't have a coach or a therapist, unless they're like, oh yeah, I had one for 20 years and I just see them periodically,
Hmm.
you need it. So if you're on this live stream and you're a CEO or a CFO or any sort of executive and you don't have
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
leadership coach and or a therapist, sometimes you need both, because that fear will come. The fear in leadership in
Hmm.
terms of leading is a scary thing to do. And so many decisions come up that make you afraid. And when you act on your fear, you start doing this weird thing like, I will choose for you. Like, this is not how
Hmm.
relationships work.
No.
And I tell people all the time, the tenets, the principles of all relationships are the same. They
Hmm.
show up differently based on the context of the relationship, right? So my husband and I have a different context. And so even though the tenets are the same, trust, communication,
Hmm. Hmm.
honesty, whatever, what we talk about, how we operate will look differently. But you and
Hmm.
I also have a relationship, Anna. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so it's
Yeah.
the same, trust. So if you don't have a therapist or a leadership coach or both, and you're in the executive position, go
Careful.
get one, because you have to work on that fear so you don't
Yeah.
make these weird choices, because you're just going to make people upset. And the fear is a like cycle fulfilling prophecy thing.
A
It's,
bit,
it's
yeah. A bit, yeah, 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 yeah,
but yeah,
yeah.
it's a
No,
lot
no,
about
no. You'll get a reality check at some point, and it's gonna be more painful, right? This is
yes,
the
yes,
situation.
yes.
Let's go a little bit forward, right? So we talked a little bit about what was happening when you started all this.
Mhm.
What's a bit the status quo, and what are people paying attention to, or what you think should pay attention to? And I love the fact that you gave us a little bit of a playbook on where to start. I think this is one of the biggest blockers in general. But I'm curious what's coming up in your view, because we talked a little bit about the legislation piece. I do see a lot of technology and providers that are also trying to ease up the way people look at pay equity, and also enhancing more or bringing more resilience in the organization's culture and future, let's say. So there are many things. I'm curious on your side, what is exciting? Let's start there and then maybe talk about what's scary.
Yeah. No, I mean, what's really exciting for me, honestly, is all the technologies.
Okay.
Really. I mean, you've got technologies like Scissarb and Syndio who look at pay equity
Mhm.
specifically and help you calculate it statistically, regression analysis and figure out where your pay gaps are. And Scissarb specifically is based in Sweden, also looks at individual countries in the
Mhm.
EU and what their laws are and if you're being compliant there. Syndio helps with workplace equity. So they're on different sides of the pond, but they have a similar role in organizations and really using technology to help you live out pay
Mhm.
equity, not just
Yeah.
talk about pay equity. I also, Gradar is a company. It's a job architecture development company, job leveling system. There are so many job leveling systems out there, and for companies who are low on cash and cannot pay 50,000 for a consultant to come in and do some big cut to come in and do things. Gradar is a very reasonably priced job architecture system that is all online, and it
Mhm.
helps you define your job. So it has a level system behind it. It also allows you to look across other types of voting systems to see
Yeah.
how it connects. So love Gradar as well. Um, I don't know. I also think just AI. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm excited for when AI can essentially take over the responsibility of building processes when you
Yeah.
tell it what you want, right? So
Mhm.
if I think about being, prompting ChatGPT, for example, learning how to prompt the AI in your HRIS systems to say, I need a process to do XYZ. Here's the context of this,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? And so giving it all the context and letting AI create that process. So you take the administrative piece out of it, but not the strategic
Mhm.
piece out of it.
Yeah.
Because what you're doing is giving them your strategy and giving it them your strategy, and it's returning back to you an administrative process that you, of course, and
Mhm.
then change, right? You
Yeah.
never just take what's coming out of AI and just the blanket. But I think this is really cool because as a rewards professional, a lot of what happens is companies put off hiring a rewards team for a very long time. And then they're in a bind when they have to
Yeah.
build all this stuff from the big scratch. And so I think AI is a great opportunity in the future that may
Yeah.
allow rewards professionals to quickly develop administrative processes that they can
That
ensure
take
align
the
with the
time.
business needs and goals, but they can stay strategic.
I think this increases accessibility, right? As well. I mean, as you say, a lot of the organizations would not be able, like literally not have the cash flow to go to the Mercer and the McKinseys and the whatever, right? Which in general, larger organizations that I was in, that's the first thing they did, right? And you don't even start the business. I opened an office in Bengaluru and we didn't start until 1 year later when we actually got all this stuff done
Yeah.
because there was cash flow and there was
Yeah.
let's say need but combined, and the democratization almost of access
Mhm.
to this type of services I love.
Yes.
And I didn't know about Grader, so I appreciate. I know about Syndio and the other one, I think Pay Analytics. I've seen also an Icelandic organization. There are plenty, and I love that you actually, as you say, we find them on both sides, European and the US, and they're accessible and they want to work as much as possible custom as well sometimes, because they are learning about this
Yes.
different type of organizations and different type of policies, and they are also growing, right? So hopefully not to the point where they become inaccessible but more will come because it's easier. And on your piece with the prompting, I'm having so much fun sometimes with all this generative AI, because sometimes I'm like, I just don't know how to properly ask, so I'm like, can what should I put in my prompt to make sure you're gonna very
Yeah,
meta.
no,
We
yeah.
get very meta with things, right?
I think, and this might, no one, no, I'm not being like a generation like ageist or whatever, but I think that for those of us who have had a long career, AI is going to make us so much more effective
Yeah.
because we know exactly what we're looking for
True.
in terms of and all the nuances and the risks and
Mhm.
challenges of what we're doing. And so being able to use generative AI or other types of AI to just make the process quicker for us,
Yeah.
right? Not that it's telling us what to do because we had the experience to know exactly what needs to be done. I think that for younger generations, using AI without the context of experience
Mm.
can get a little bit dangerous because now you're in a situation where you don't know if AI is saying what makes sense. You
Yeah.
actually don't know.
Totally.
You can read it and go, that doesn't make any sense. Next,
Totally.
but I feel excited about that because
Yeah.
that means that I can become more effective leader and
Mm.
a more effective strategic leader as well, because I can be more efficient in
Mm.
doing certain things, right?
Yeah.
So, and I have the context to be able to make sure it's tailored for the organization and that I have all of that, risks and challenges and all that kind of thing considered and know what bumps are coming, when we're
Yeah.
doing certain things. So I think it's going to be fun. I mean, there are a bunch of challenges.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong. A bunch of things that are a problem with AI that I do not like they're doing now in terms of what they're trying to do, but
Yeah.
there are some positives, certainly.
Very, very, very. I think a lot, and we will continue to learn there. I am now. I just remember because there's something that I feel it is a point of cynicism, maybe when it comes to pay equity and pay transparency in the US. And because you come from that environment, somehow you probably have this perspective. A lot of people, like whenever we talk about pay equity and the directive from the EU, and at the conference when we were with Anita, and we had
Yes,
some
yes.
very interesting conversations later in the weeks, meeting with different clients and partners and so on. I see a lot of cynicism around, yeah, but you can go around it.
Mm,
I cannot tell you how many times I've heard this.
mhm,
And I
mhm,
find it very sad in a way because these things are built to help you. And sometimes we
mhm.
just go by default. Let's find a way to go around it because it creates work, because it, creates change when we don't like change, etc., etc. But also because these professionals have seen some of these um, going around the bush type of situation in the US, where you have legislation where you need to publish salary bands, or you need to publish kind of on job offers on job portals, etc., etc. And different organizations try to avoid, or kind of, I don't know, go the
Do good stuff. Yeah, like put a
use
salary range
shortcuts.
50,000 to
Yeah,
375,000. You're like, that's not a salary range.
yeah, exactly, right.
Yeah,
And
uh-huh.
is that something that you think we will see in Europe? Is that something that we can avoid as professionals?
Can we avoid companies considering the risk of legislation? No.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
that's what it comes down to. So, to remind employees that businesses have a responsibility to look at the risk of what it looks like in that environment, that
Mm-hmm.
legislative environment, right? So, that's one of the external factors that affect businesses. And so, they're always going to be looking to see what is the risk of doing or not doing this.
Mm-hmm.
Always. That is part of legal's job. As a part of,
Yeah.
as a whole risk department,
Yeah.
right? Doing that. So, we will never get out of that because it's actually prudent for companies to do so.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is where employees might go, why would it be prudent for an organization to not follow the law? It's prudent because organizations have a responsibility. Their first responsibility is to shareholders if they're
Yeah.
publicly traded, but also to investors if they are, startups and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
That's the reality. That's the
Yeah.
reality. So we have to be honest. Let's just be radical acceptance. Their first responsibility is to investors and shareholders. That's the reality. So it is prudent in their business to determine if following a law or not following a law is good for them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That is their job. So we'll never get out of it. What the real question for me is, are we as employees going to start taking the values seriously enough to interrogate
Mm-hmm.
those companies honor their values?
Mm-hmm.
Because if the company is out here saying things like we are compliant or whatever things they say, that
Yeah.
are out there, right?
Yeah. We did the audit. Everything is fine.
Right? Did you? Right? And how do I know you did it without the transparency? So you can't get out of it. This kind of skirting, trying to skirt.
Mm-hmm.
Legislators are always slower than business. That has always been the case. So, we're going to have to get over the fact that it takes forever for some things to get legislated. And as an American, that's just the reality of my work
Mm-hmm.
experience and knowing that. But yeah, as an employee, to you said before about choice, you have the right to interrogate their values. And because they put them out there. I didn't ask for them. You put them online.
Yeah.
Let me understand. Do you really do these? And then make a decision about whether or not that's a place you want to be. As a total awards professional, I have worked in companies who have chosen certain things against compliance. And I've worked there. I've
Mm-hmm.
stayed there. It's not because I agree with them,
Mm-hmm.
but I understand the assignment that they have.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Mm-hmm.
and I don't mix it up with my own moral code. And
Mm-hmm.
this is the other part of it. I have values and I live into my values and try and live with integrity. But
Yeah.
I have a moral code that nobody's asking me for. The executives
Mm-hmm.
aren't asking me my moral, my assessment of their morality
Yeah.
and how well they'll deal with legality. They're not asking me that. So, it's cynical to say it, but it's not really because it's true. I would just say that if you're in a position to make those decisions, don't be that person.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Don't
Mm-hmm.
make those decisions. And if you're in a position to influence decision makers, do your best to do so. And also just recognize that this is the system that we live in. It is, and we didn't create it, but we live in it. Where we can make changes, do so. Where we can't,
Yeah.
we make choices for ourselves that we think are best for our own lives.
It's I love your pragmatic approach, and I live by that as well because I also feel it's protecting my mental health.
Protect your peace.
Fully.
That's what
Protect
comes
your peace, for sure. But I actually have here a book like paying matters, and it goes a lot into also the okay, we communicate transparently maybe about mistakes that we've done, and we communicate transparently about the fixes that we're trying to do, and we communicate transparently maybe. So let's say we are in that kind of organization, but pay is such a personal topic. It's such an emotional topic, right?
Absolutely.
And I think we need to kind of have a little bit of a I don't even know, advice or coaching on word choosing and language in general, because people will react, right? There will be an emotional reaction, and on any. So
Yeah.
transparency will bring that. So I
Yeah.
think a lot of the resistance that we have is coming from estimating, hey, we're going to have a year of difficult conversations
Yeah.
on one, on all corners of the company, on all things. And it is difficult, but I kind of maybe from how do you navigate, how do you overcome this resistance when you try to bring more transparency, while, as you say, maybe keeping it compliant, but also risk assessing those risks, right? um where do you go in your mind, and how do you coach your leaders to um, create a level of communicate, a level of transparency that doesn't necessarily hit the wall, right? Because I think this is where the risk is. Too much transparency sometimes can shatter trust as
Mhm.
well, right? I think there is a there's a fine line there.
I mean that it is also depending on the company,
Mm.
because some companies they'll just tell it all, and
Mhm.
the employees expect it and respect it. Other
Yeah.
companies, yeah, got to be a little bit careful. So for me, so what is the culture? Right? So what's the
Yes,
live culture?
culture,
So
culture,
what's the
culture.
live culture
Yeah,
around communication,
yeah.
right? Um, and then you know, it's more about what is the problem we're trying to solve or the goal we're trying to achieve. So
Mhm,
when you ask those questions and get specific about that, and you have alignment from those who are making decisions, right? What do we have a problem? What is it? And really
mhm,
diving into what is the real problem,
mhm,
because you can always communicate the problem you tried to solve.
mhm.
Always. You don't. There's no reason to not communicate it.
Yeah.
This was the problem. The problem was we were finding that certain people
Mhm,
in the organization, certain roles, we had big attrition, and
mhm,
we dug into it and realized we had a pay problem. And we
mhm,
decided we were going to fix that pay problem and also look across the organization to see if we had other pay problems, right?
mhm,
So we were looking into a problem that we were having and diving into it, and this is what we came up with, right?
mhm,
Or a goal we're trying to achieve. We are trying to achieve the goal of meeting certain specific deliverables in the next 12 months. And so we're going to implement a pay for performance culture, align with, a performance process, and we're trying to
mhm.
achieve this goal. Here's how we're going to do it, and we're
Yeah.
going to see if that actually supports us. So when you communicate the why, essentially, what problem, what goal, um,
Mhm,
then you craft a message that's appropriate for the communication culture of that company. And so it's
mhm,
not about having to be, sometimes you have to be fully transparent because the communication culture is like that, other times not. I also think that utilizing unions or employee
mhm.
resource groups or works councils is really important. I know a lot of companies do not like having any of them as a part of their organization,
Yep.
but okay, radical acceptance, they're here and here to stay, right? So
Yeah.
let's just move on, protect our peace and move on and build that relationship, because what I found is that when the people who represent the employees understand
Mhm,
what you're doing and have had an opportunity to interrogate it, right? They walk away with more respect after you've been honest with them. So
mhm,
utilize those groups to help also craft a message, right?
mhm,
What do you think employees will respond to? What are some of the things that are going to come up? How do you think we can mitigate that? Ask
mhm.
them. Like, don't just let them sit there and not
Figure
be,
out.
yeah, exactly. And not engaging with minds on how
Mm.
this can be better communicated. Do that certainly. That's what I would say.
Okay, I just want to add one thing, because I fully agree, and I've noticed there is a things like, but we said that. I'm like, well, also the job is to repeat all this,
Right.
probably.
It's not, yeah, you're right. It's not just communication, it's education. And if
Uh-huh.
any of you
Yes.
remember being in school, especially when you were younger, what did the teacher do? She always
Mhm,
repeated the lesson because you needed a repetition to be educated about it. So communication is usually a one hit shot, but education is
yeah,
repetition, repetition, repetition.
yeah,
And that's how it becomes a practice and lived value or behavior, because you're repeating it constantly. Is it annoying sometimes? Certainly it's annoying sometimes. But you know what? More annoying is in later having a bigger problem because nobody
yeah.
understands. even though
And
you
to
can.
have retention issues and to really get into also compliance issues and high risk problems, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
We didn't talk about this, and I don't know if it's really the scope or if you have, but I have an internal curiosity, right? Because I think we talk a lot about gender pay gap, and let's say this is a pattern recognized in organizations, public institution, et cetera, around maybe again in the binary matrix, men and women being paid differently. Are there any other patterns that you observed? And if I am an employer, maybe if I find other dimensions, other type of underrepresented groups that get affected, I should not be surprised. Like, is there more tenure? Is there more ageism? Is there more, I don't know, time of hire? What are some maybe main, I don't know, patterns
Yeah,
affected, right?
yeah.
A pattern demographics, let's say so.
All of those things:
Yeah.
age, tenure, ability or disability,
Mhm,
if they're a parent or not, a
mhm,
caregiver,
mhm,
your ethnicity, your gender expression, your sexuality. These are all a part of it. Depending on where you are in the world, it can be more
mhm.
challenging to collect certain data.
Yeah.
But it's in Germany, it's not, a lot of people say in Germany you can't collect GDPR. It's not true. You can. GDPR absolutely allows you to. You just
Yeah.
have to do it the right way. And so
Mhm,
if you do it the right way, you can collect certain information and you can also, measure your pay against that. Um, when you think about ageism,
mhm.
women at the age of 40 begin to experience it. I just turned 40 this year. And
Yay.
men at the age of like 45.
Yeah.
So both men and women experience ageism, right?
Mhm,
Um,
mhm,
I would also dive into things like, for example, what traditionally is a male role versus a female role.
mhm, mhm,
Years ago, there was a big lawsuit in the UK, and within the government system, there were like garbage workers, and there were cleaning workers. And the
mhm.
garbage workers were traditionally male, and the cleaning workers traditionally.
Mm,
And what happened was you find that these jobs are quite similar in nature in terms of they're doing similar work,
mhm.
and they're paying the women, the
The
females, so
range.
much less. And the government lost and had like a billion. It was a lot of money they had to pay,
Yes.
right? So also look at your organization and say, okay, we traditionally have, men
Mhm,
or women or non-binary individuals in this
mhm,
role.
mhm,
So we look at HR, and I like the RBG method. I don't
mm.
know if anybody knows Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She
Yeah.
was the U.S. Supreme Court first female U.S. Supreme Court justice. She passed away the past few years, but she became famous. Her first trial was in front of the Supreme Court, and she became famous in that trial because she used the patriarchy against itself. She
Mhm,
had a male client, and she was able to prove that the law that they had negatively impacted the man. And so
mm.
the law had to change, which meant that women now were benefited. It was a different time, and so she went that route, and it worked. It worked
Yeah,
big time. It was
yeah,
awesome. So it's the RBG method because, for example, in HR, who owns HR? Usually women.
yeah.
So go and check and see if the men in that HR organization are negatively impacted by your pay policies there, because they might be.
Mhm,
It's
mhm.
not Pay equity is not about male or female. It's about
Sure.
male and female and non-binary. It's
Mhm,
also about
mhm.
ethnicities and all kind of things. So there's a lot of different dimensions you can look at. And if you're talking about dignity and upholding humanity, everybody's humanity and all the dimensions is important. So figuring out how to get as many dimensions as possible, and then
Mhm.
making sure that you're paying fairly in that way. You also find a lot of different biases come up.
Yeah.
We're humans, and that's what happens, right? So these kinds of processes help to highlight the biases, also can help you reduce the biases in the future.
Yeah, yeah, almost simultaneous. I think it's the wake up call
Yep.
that
Yep.
we see. Michelle, this has been amazing. We're getting close to the end.
Yeah.
I want usually to leave this space with maybe one takeaway, one piece of advice that the experts like you on these sessions can inspire some of those listening on. If I do something different tomorrow, what would I start with? What would that one thing that you would like those who are working in any closeness to talent decisions and pay decisions and people culture decisions can look from your perspective?
So I don't know the demographic of the people on the call, but I will say if you are a decision maker, right? As you mentioned, like being close to pay decisions. If you're a decision maker, especially if you're a CXO of any sort, um, you need to be the face of pay equity.
Mm,
You have to be the face of fair pay programs. You have to be
mhm,
the face of it. Um, because it affects your culture. And if you are at those levels, you should be the most vocal person about a healthy culture. You have to be if you're going to be a leader, in my opinion, of any sort, right? You have to be the most vocal about a healthy culture. And a healthy culture requires that you're looking at things like having fair pay programs. So you have to be the face. And for those who are not in that level of making those choices and decisions, let me go back. If you are the face, I would say starting January 1, 2021, make the EU pay directive compliance as much as you can because we don't have all the countries a strategic initiative. It's a
mhm,
strategic business goal to be compliant with the EU pay directive. Put that on the list and make some executive accountable for it and put it in their performance
mhm,
expectations. So if you've got that level, that's what you should be doing practically. But if you're not at that level
yeah.
and you're just trying to get stuff done, I'm going to say something that might be controversial, but I'll say all of your leaders are humans.
Mhm,
And as we ask them to uphold our humanity, that being dignity, we must also give them that same grace. Um, Leadership is difficult. It is challenging. It challenges your own value system, your own integrity. It challenges
day in, day.
day in and day out. So if you're not in that position and you're trying to, push for certain
Mhm,
things, just give grace. You
mhm.
don't have to, give
Hammer in, yeah.
yeah, yeah, but just give grace because most people aren't looking to do harm,
Mhm,
right? And it's not about, the intention impact, conversation can happen, but they're not looking to do harm. And so your job is to highlight where the harm is,
mhm,
and help them to understand that. So, yeah, just give your leaders grace because they don't have the answers. They
mhm.
don't have the answers. And whatever answer you have is your job to learn how to communicate that well so they can actually listen to it and then make some choices. So, yeah, and protect your peace. Some
Take your
stuff you're
piece.
not going to be able to do. And it's
No,
like,
maybe not this year, maybe not this in this lifetime, but
yes. It's like it's some stuff you have to let go because your mental health, your peace, and your humanity is more important
yeah.
than all this stuff. This
Mhm,
important
mhm,
stuff, but your own personal peace is more important than that.
mhm.
Because you want to be able to care for yourself for a long time and not have the burnout impact, all that sort of thing. So give them grace and protect your peace. That's what I would say.
I have one thing to say, which is connect with Nichelle. Reach out to
Yes,
Nichelle. She,
please.
whatever you saw here is the super distilled version of everything that you can bring to these conversations, Nichelle, and also the expertise, but the perspective. I think this is for me the most important part. We can solve a lot of things if we have the right attitude towards it, and if we think problem solution, not just problem, right? Like there's
Yes,
always
yes,
something. There's always something
yes.
that can be done, and I appreciate you sharing all your insights with us, but also all your passion. I've learned a lot myself, and I think this is
Okay.
why I'm doing these sessions.
Awesome. Yeah, yeah, great, great. I've
So
enjoyed myself. Thank you for all the questions and for your engagement. And thanks for everybody who joined.
amazing. For those who've joined, for those who're gonna listen to this asynchronous, because that's why we love the internet. This session lives now on YouTube. We are now also streaming on YouTube for about 2-3 weeks, but also on LinkedIn, of course. And we will share a summary tomorrow as well for those who prefer more reading than listening to us babbling here. But follow Fair Cultures for all the new sessions that we have on a weekly basis. And of course, for those interested, we did a soft launch. We're going to communicate much more in the coming weeks about Fair Barcelona, the Workplace Inclusion Conference happening 15th of May here in Barcelona at Joao Miró Museum again. Nichelle, I hope to see you again.
I hope so
Uh,
too. It was great last year. It was great.
so I thank everybody who was with us today. We are very much on time. Thank you so much, Nichelle. We'll see you soon, online, offline. I'm sure we'll reconnect. Bye, everyone.
Absolutely. Bye.